Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to my channel. And I have a book for you I want to talk about today. It is something I read last winter. It is from Princeton University Press. And it is a bit of literary history, which doesn't find its way onto my Historathon reading list very often, but I'm going to try to change that in the future. I want to read more about authors, their lives, life writing. This is a biography of a very brief chunk of Thomas Mann's life. This is called The Mind in Exile, Thomas Mann in Princeton by Stanley Corngold, by Princeton University Press, published in, let me check, 2022. So this is Stanley Corngold's latest book. He is a professor emeritus of comparative literature at Princeton, and he's also one of the foremost living scholars of Franz Kafka, who he has written several other books about. But in this one, he forays into the life of another 20th century literary giant, Thomas Mann, to look at three very formative years that he spent in the United States, of all places, in Princeton, New Jersey. Those years being 1938 to 1941. And it was during these years at Princeton that the final steps in his conversion from a nationalist arch-conservative in the European mold to an ardent social democrat took place. Mann was in Switzerland in 1933 when he first learned from two of his children, actually, that Hitler had seized power and that his return to Germany would be ill-advised, to say the least. In the years during and shortly after World War I, Mann never explicitly espoused the nationalism that was sort of in the air, but he did act like he was above the political fray. As the title of his series of essays suggests, he called it Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which he published during World War I, 1918. In these essays, he washed his hands of politics in a kind of Pontius Pilate gesture, claiming that the job of the intellectual was moral and cultural guidance, not engagement with the vulgar or the political. This concept of moral and cultural guidance and formation really obsessed German philosophers and cultural critics in the 19th century. The Germans have a word for it. It's called Bildung. And that's basically what Mann thought the purview of the artist was, that especially he as a writer was there for your moral and intellectual enrichment and guidance. And that politics was just earthly, it's dirty, and that we're sort of above that. But that all changed with the rise of National Socialism when Hitler comes to power, learning that the new leader of your country has proclaimed you an enemy of the state and that you can't go back to your home, does have an odd way of politically galvanizing you, I guess. Instead of returning home to Germany, he went to Switzerland, where he remained until the verge of World War II, when he finally moved to Princeton in 1938. And here he rubbed shoulders with the likes of Albert Einstein, historian Erich Kahler, and fellow novelist Hermann Broch. This is where Corngold's story of Mann really begins. Aside from his teaching duties at the university and his novel writing, he wrote Lotte in Weimar there. He also wrote The Transposed Heads. And he also wrote the final volume of the Joseph trilogy, the Joseph and his brothers tetralogy that he wrote there. Aside from that, Mann produces an impressive number of political essays and articles in which he bemoans what was happening to his native country. He also traveled the United States and gave dozens of radio addresses, which Mann referred to as, quote, rocks thrown into Hitler's window. Chapter 2 of the book, which is called Reflections of a Political Man, takes up about 120 pages of the 216-page book and contains a pretty detailed analysis of the major speeches and articles that Mann produced during these few years, like I said, 1938 to 1941. The common themes are probably obvious: the threat of appeasement in the form of the 1938 Munich Pact, National Socialism as a sign of moral and intellectual crisis, and a sort of existential danger to the possibility of Bildung, or as Mann tends to call it, the formation of the German spirit, and the moral and artistic duty of intellectuals to fight all strains of totalitarian thought and support democracy. Mann also advocated for the United States to take up a more assertive, stabilizing role in protecting democracy around the world. And while he understood the isolationist sentiments of the United States leading up to World War II, he criticized people like Franklin Roosevelt, who he generally really liked, for waiting until 1941 to enter the war. In fact, there are parts of the Joseph and his brothers tetralogy which are basically paeans to Roosevelt's New Deal economic system, which is something that I didn't know because I haven't read the trilogy or tetralogy yet. But yeah, apparently he talks about Roosevelt's New Deal in the context of making it about Egyptian, because part of the Joseph and his brothers takes place in ancient Egypt economic policy instead of, but the parallels are really similar. While Mann's politics did take a turn toward the more humanist and international and democratic, they always kept their patina of elite European conservatism, I think. Judging from his articles and speeches alone, Mann was more concerned with the protection of artistic freedoms than political ones, artistic freedoms being his freedoms. While far from a zealot, he also thought Christianity had a unique role in promoting the values that supported his humanist project. He was very much a humanist, but he was a Christian humanist, not a secular one. And while it can be argued that he became more secular in his later years, he never stopped believing that Christianity was central to Western ideas of ethics and personhood. Nevertheless, the shift his politics took in the interwar years amounted to a sea change that was so drastic that even after the defeat of Hitler at the end of the war, he still chose not to return home to his native country, at least partially because he was so sickened at what Germany had allowed to happen to itself. Despite Corngold's hand-waving about Mann's supposed full-throated conversion to democracy, there are aspects of the book that remain not fully fleshed out, or that Mann hadn't fully considered himself. There are several times, for example, in Mann's articles where he displays kind of a tin-eared lack of concern with artistic expression, while barely, like I mentioned earlier, barely mentioning that Hitler was even engaged in systematic genocide. I think he mentioned somewhere in the book where Mann said at some point that he didn't even know that a genocide was happening until 1942 or 1943. and people understandably expressed some suspicion about that, but he continued to say that for a long time, that he didn't know that. He didn't deny it once he actually did learn about it, but he did, for being such a worldly, well-read man, seems to have missed some important aspects of world news as they were developing. Mann spoke out against Hitler, but it was usually because of the harm he was doing to, like I said, intellectual freedom, or this amorphous thing called the German spirit. Consequently, despite it taking the cataclysmic entry of Hitler into German life to register Mann's interest in politics, his concern never rises to be anything more than a kind of woolly, disinterested, overly intellectualized observation of things from afar. For all of his opposition to Nazi Germany, Mann's furor was much more directed at totalitarian thought and how it targeted him as an artist, specifically, than it ever was at the idea that millions of people were being killed in the name of something like racial purification. Mann may have never known what it was like to live under Hitler until he discovered that his time in the United States had earned him a 100-page long file compiled by the House Un-American Activities Committee, excuse me, HUAC, under the assumption that he held communist sympathies. Only then, when he himself had suddenly become the object of suspicion, did he finally realize that no one was safe from the pernicious logic of fascism. By then, the war had already been won and lost, though, because this was in the early 1950s or very late 40s. If anything, Mann's transition to a political figure during the rise of Hitler can serve as an object lesson for the rest of us. When you speak out for yourself, if you have to speak out for yourself, ensure that your own narrow sense of privilege doesn't prevent you from also speaking out for others in times when they need it most. A really interesting book about a period of Mann's life I didn't know much about. His Princeton years. The Mind in Exile. Thomas Mann in Princeton by Stanley Corngold. I will see you soon with another video. Bye.